Hello, everyone. I hope that you can all hear me and that the stream is all going fine. My name is Jason. I'm going to be presenting the topic for today. I'm going to be talking a lot about principles. So that's the main objective of this talk today. I'm going to first of all describe exactly how we do good principled analysis and the methodology behind principles. And I'm going to chat about how we get out of the consequentialist bubble that we are oftentimes stuck in within debate and how to do so persuasively in such a way that you can successfully change the metric for any round in a way that means that you have much more room to effectively argue and particularly to be able to deepen the debate in which in many circumstances ends up being shallow. Before I get into anything, I do want to just remind everyone to donate to the Thitani Debating League. There's information in the sidebar and you can get access to figuring out how to do that donation, but it'd be really, really important because it helps to build up global debate communities, and I think it's a really, really valuable endeavor. So please, please do consider donating, especially if you end up enjoying this talk afterwards. So the very first thing that I want to begin with in terms of talking about principles is a discussion as to how principled argumentation works and what the general landscape of debating is like for principled arguments. I think it's unsurprising that most people would probably recognize that people in debate don't really respect principled arguments. And in particular, they don't respect a certain type of principled argument. The type of principle that is oftentimes difficult to make in debate rounds are freestanding principles. So principles that apply irrespective of any consequences at all. And it's really important to note here that there are lots of principled arguments that we make which are anti-utilitarian but are still acceptable. So for instance, let's consider our general arguments based on helping vulnerable groups. That vulnerable groups have been wronged or have been discriminated against in the past and therefore deserve additional redress and protection in terms of reparations or any other potential good that might be granted. Here you can tell that we already don't use a utilitarian metric because a true utilitarian would say something like, well, the reason why this is good is because of the fact that they have higher marginal utility from each contribution that an individual gets. So the really difficult thing to do is to be able to establish freestanding principles. And I think that the reason why it's so difficult to establish freestanding principles is the way of reasoning that debaters use in debate rounds. Because we always assume that the only valuable thing is analysis, and we always want to get to a certain goal. But philosophy oftentimes works the opposite way around. It says, X thing is bad. We know X thing is bad, and as a consequence, we need to find an account or an explanation of why X thing is bad. So for instance, because we know murder is bad, we need to find some kind of philosophical basis or understanding for doing this. And this is the thing that ends up really swamping philosophy and principles in debating, because people typically don't have a reasoning which starts from this. But I mean, almost all utilitarianism and consequentialism also starts with these kinds of baseline assumptions about what is right or wrong and the works towards them. Something like murder, for instance, we just accept as wrong. And so the question of any debate is, how do we get there? And people assume that we just want to stop that kind of murder. So it seems somewhat incoherent to me that we accept certain types of given assumptions over other sorts of given assumptions. And part of the thing that you need to do in making freestanding principles is to really convince your audience that the implicit assumption that you are making in your case is the correct one, that X thing is incorrect, it is so wrong that no matter what consequentialist metric exists, you can't justify it. A really strong example that I think typically attacks utilitarianism is something like slavery, where even if slavery could presumably receive better results for a majority group within a country, it is still obviously immoral, still obviously wrong in a way that doesn't account for utility and in a way that disregards utility. So this is kind of just the baseline as to what the problem in debate is, how exactly we want to think about principles, and how we should conceptualize them. Now, the next parts of my talk are going to have a few different sections. The first section, I'm going to discuss why it is the case that we might not need to ever use principles in certain debates and how exactly we can develop arguments in that way. The second section is going to be talking about vague problems with consequentialism and utilitarianism and how we can use these sorts of thought experiments and quibbles as arguments within debate rounds. And finally, I'm going to go over a set of different principled arguments that commonly come about. So in particular, I want to talk about political obligation between the state and individuals and the idea of choice as a separate category afterwards. And then finally, ethics, morality, and how people should treat one another. Great. So let's begin by talking a little bit about some of the generic flaws that I think can end up coming about within utilitarianism debates and some of the ways, First, let's talk about ways that we can avoid any of these concerns about utilitarianism, have a consequentialist debate, and still be able to explain differences in things, then talk about that stuff about utilitarianism and its flaws. So the first thing that I want to talk about is just the fact that oftentimes you're going to be pushed into corners within various debate rounds. So debate teams will oftentimes ask you whether or not you support X or Y thing, or they'll implicitly try and get you into making concessions about your conception of the world, particularly within POIs. They'll also oftentimes use thought experiments to try and forward their own principled analysis. So the first thing that I want to say in terms of how we can end up being effective principled debaters, even within this utilitarian world that is happening, is to consider all the various explanations in terms of their principle. Because when they make a principle, they're obviously going to have some set of key assumptions behind it. Like, for instance, attempted murder is wrong. That might be a claim that they make, independent of any effects that has on a person. Even if that person doesn't know that there was a plot to kill them, attempted murder is clearly wrong. And in rebutting that claim, we can oftentimes think about consequential justifications, which can help explain why something is wrong. So for instance, we might be able to say that the reason why attempted murder is punished so heavily is the fact that obviously we want to